Welcome back to Midnight Chronicle. Tonight we're going somewhere cold, somewhere dark and wind-bitten and startlingly beautiful. We're going to the Viking Age. Not the version you know from television or films or the horned helmets that never actually existed. The real one. The one made of salt spray and firelight and long winters and extraordinary journeys. The one where the people were not monsters, not myths, but human beings living one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the world. Before we set sail, if Midnight Chronicle has become the voice you fall asleep to, a quiet subscribe means everything. No pressure at all, only if this feels like your kind of place. And leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are. I love knowing who is out there in the dark with me. Now, pull the covers close, let the room go dark, and let the north find you. To understand the Vikings, you have to understand the land that made them. Scandinavia in the 8th century is not a comfortable place. The winters are savage and long. In the far north, the sun disappears entirely for weeks at a time, and the darkness is complete and total. Not the comfortable darkness of a room with curtains drawn, but the absolute darkness of a sky without stars, a land without light, a cold that gets into the bones and stays. The summers are brief and brilliant, almost violent in their contrast. The landscape is fjords and forest and rock. The soil, where there is soil, is thin and difficult. The sea is everywhere. It is the sea that explains everything. When your land cannot feed everyone who lives on it, when the winters get harder, and the population grows and the farms can no longer expand because there is only so much tillable ground between the mountains and the water, you look out. You have always looked out. The sea is right there. It has always been right there. And somewhere beyond it, if the stories of the traders who passed through are to be believed, there are lands of extraordinary richness. Green islands, river valleys, monasteries full of gold and silver and no army to defend them. The first Viking raid on the British Isles took place in 793 CE, when longships appeared out of the sea mist off the coast of Northumbria and struck the monastery at Lindisfarne. The monks had no warning and no defence. The raiders took what they could carry and were gone before anyone could respond. To the Christian world of Europe it seemed like the end of days. Pagan northerners striking from the sea, attacking the sacred places of God. Impossible, and yet entirely real. But this is where the untold part begins. Because the raid at Lindisfarne is where most people's knowledge of the Vikings starts and very nearly ends, and it represents perhaps the least interesting thing about them. Let us talk about the ships. Because the Viking longship is one of the greatest technological achievements of the medieval world, and it does not get nearly enough credit. It is a masterpiece of engineering arrived at not through calculation and blueprint, but through generations of accumulated knowledge passed hand to hand, generation to generation, by people who understood wood and water with an intimacy that bordered on the spiritual. The longship is clinker-built, meaning the planks of its hull overlap each other like scales, each one riveted to the next. This gives the hull a flexibility that rigid-built ships lack. In heavy seas, a longship does not fight the waves, it bends with them. Sailors who crossed the North Atlantic in reconstructed Viking vessels in the 20th century described a quality they had not expected. The hull moving beneath them, breathing almost, the whole ship alive in a way that modern steel vessels are not. It was frightening at first. Then it was reassuring. The ship knew what to do. The longship's draft, the depth it sits in the water, is extraordinarily shallow. A fully loaded vessel might sit only a metre below the surface. This means it can navigate rivers that would stop any other ocean-going ship. The Vikings did not just cross seas, they went up rivers, the Seine to Paris, the Thames to London, the Dnieper all the way down to Constantinople, which they called Miklagard, the great city. They carried their ships overland between rivers when necessary, rolling them on logs, 100 men moving a vessel that weighed tons across landscapes that had never seen a sail. And then there is the navigation. How do you cross the open North Atlantic without a compass? The compass would not reach Scandinavia until the 12th century at the earliest. Without GPS, without charts, without any of the instruments that modern sailors consider essential? How do you find Iceland from Norway, a journey of about 1,000 kilometers across open ocean? How do you then find Greenland from Iceland? How do you find North America from Greenland? The answer is a combination of things so deeply understood they had become instinct. The position of the sun at noon told you your latitude. The stars at night, Polaris most importantly, but the whole wheel of the night sky, kept you oriented. The colour of the water changed as you approached land. Floating vegetation told you how close you were and in which direction. Birds, certain species that do not venture far from shore, appeared in patterns the navigators had memorized over generations. Clouds tend to form and hold over land even when the land itself is below the horizon. The swell patterns of the open ocean carry information about distant coastlines in the way they interact and reflect. There is also the sunstone, a piece of Icelandic spar, a form of calcite crystal that polarizes light. On an overcast day, when the sun is invisible, holding a sunstone up to the sky and rotating it reveals the position of the sun through the pattern of polarized light. Viking sagas mention sunstones. For centuries, historians assumed this was legend. Then researchers tested Icelandic spar in overcast conditions. It works. The sun is findable. The ocean is crossable. 500 years before Columbus, a Viking navigator named Leif Erikson stood on the coast of North America and looked at a land no European had ever seen. In 1904, near a farm called Oseberg on the western shore of the Oslofjord in Norway, archaeologists uncovered what remains one of the most extraordinary finds in Viking history. Beneath a great mound of earth, preserved by the blue clay that had sealed it from oxygen for over 1,000 years, was a complete Viking longship. And inside the ship, buried with extraordinary care and extraordinary wealth, were 2 women. The ship itself was a masterpiece. 71 feet long, carved with intricate spiral patterns along the prow and stern, built of oak, fitted with a mast and 15 pairs of oars. It had never been a warship. It was a ceremonial vessel, too fine and too decorated for the practicalities of raiding or trading. It was a ship for someone important, someone who, in death, deserved to sail. The burial goods were staggering. 4 sledges, elaborately carved. A cart, the only Viking Age cart ever found, decorated with scenes of extraordinary mythological complexity. Beds, tapestries, kitchen equipment, chests of clothing, 15 horses, 6 dogs, 2 oxen. Everything that would be needed in the Viking conception of the afterlife to live well and travel far. One of the 2 women was old, 70 to 80 years of age, with severe arthritis and a healed Colles fracture of the wrist from a fall earlier in her life. She had been buried in the ship's cabin, on a proper bed, with feather pillows. The other was younger, somewhere between 50 and 60. She was buried nearby. Their relationship, who they were to each other, which was the mistress and which the servant, or whether that framing is even correct, has been debated by scholars for a century. Recent DNA analysis has revealed something extraordinary. The older woman had ancestry from the Middle East, specifically from a region corresponding to modern Iran or Iraq. She was not a native Scandinavian. She had come from somewhere impossibly far by the standards of the 9th century. How? Trade routes. The Vikings were not just raiders. They were the most wide-ranging traders of the medieval world, and their network stretched from the Arctic to Baghdad. Silk found in Viking graves in Norway originated in Central Asia. Coins from the Caliphate of Baghdad have been found in Swedish fields by the thousand. This woman, buried with such care in a ship on the coast of Norway, had arrived at the far end of a chain of human connection that stretched across half the world. Who she was exactly remains unknown, but she was important enough to be buried like a queen, in a ship, in a mound, with everything she would need for the journey ahead. The word Viking itself is a point of confusion. In Old Norse, Vikingur refers specifically to a person engaged in a sea voyage, a raider, a traveller. It was not an ethnic identity, it was more like a job description, and most people in Scandinavia during the Viking Age were not doing it. Most people were farmers. The typical Norse household of the 9th or 10th century is a longhouse, a single great room, sometimes 30 metres long, with walls of timber or turf, a hearth running down the centre of the earthen floor, and sleeping benches along the sides. It is shared, in the colder months, with the livestock, cattle and sheep and goats brought inside because their body heat contributes to the warmth of the space. It smells of animal and smoke, and the particular dense smell of many people living very close together. But it is not squalid. It is organised. There are carved wooden chests for storage, iron cooking pots suspended over the fire, oil lamps of soapstone that cast a warm amber light. Rugs and furs cover the sleeping benches. In the evenings, people spin and weave and carve and tell stories and play games. Food is substantial and surprisingly varied. Bread made from barley and rye, porridge, dried and smoked fish, cod particularly, dried until it is hard as wood and will last for months, beef and mutton preserved in salt or whey, dairy, butter, cheese, skyr, the thick soured milk that modern Icelanders still eat and that has recently appeared in supermarkets around the world rebranded as Icelandic yogurt, wild game, deer, elk, bear, berries in summer, dried for winter, hazelnuts, apples, honey from hives kept near the farm. The Viking diet was not elegant, but it was not inadequate. The skeletal evidence suggests a generally well-nourished population, at least compared to their European contemporaries. Norse women had legal rights that would not be matched in most of Europe for nearly 1,000 years. They could own property, they could inherit, they could divorce their husbands, and the sagas record several women who did exactly that, in some cases simply because they had decided they were done. They managed the household and its finances while their husbands were away, which could mean months or years at a time. They held the keys, literally, on a ring at their belt, a symbol of domestic authority that had real, practical weight. The key holder controlled the storerooms, the food supply, the silver. The key holder ran the farm. There is also growing archaeological evidence that some Norse women fought. A grave discovered in Birka, Sweden in the 19th century was long assumed to belong to a male warrior. It contained weapons, a horse, military equipment consistent with a high-ranking fighter. When DNA analysis was applied in 2017, the skeleton was found to be female. She had been buried with a sword, an axe, 2 spears, armor-piercing arrows, a horse, and a gaming set suggesting strategic military thinking. She was not a symbolic burial. Her bones showed wear consistent with a lifetime of physical activity. She was a warrior. The scholarly community had simply assumed otherwise for 150 years, because women warriors did not fit the expected narrative. The Norse mythological world is one of the richest and strangest ever created by human imagination, and it is stranger than popular culture gives it credit for. It begins not with harmony, but with a void, Ginnungagap, the yawning gap, a nothingness so complete it is almost beyond comprehension. Into this void come fire from the south, and ice from the north, and from their meeting comes the first being, Ymir, a frost giant of terrifying size, who sweats in his sleep, and from his sweat the first beings are born. The gods who eventually create the world do so from violence. They kill Ymir, and from his body they build everything. His flesh becomes the earth, his blood becomes the sea, his bones become the mountains, his skull becomes the sky, held up at the 4 corners by dwarves, his brain becomes the clouds. It is a creation myth of extraordinary brutal poetry. The world is made of a body, and somewhere in that fact is something true about the relationship between life and death, between what is destroyed and what is built from the destruction. Odin is not the straightforward king god that later interpretations often make him. He is a wanderer, a questioner, a seeker of knowledge at any cost. He sacrificed one eye to drink from the well of wisdom. He hung himself on the world tree for 9 days and 9 nights, wounded by his own spear, to gain the knowledge of the runes. He travels in disguise, an old man with a wide-brimmed hat and a staff, appearing unexpectedly at the doorways of the important and the unimportant alike. He's not entirely trustworthy. He is fascinating. Thor is more straightforward, strong, loud, loyal, occasionally not the sharpest axe in the longhouse, but enormously beloved, because Thor protects. His hammer Mjolnir is a symbol of protection, not just destruction, and the Norse wore miniature hammers around their necks the way Christians wore crosses. When Christianity arrived in Scandinavia and crosses began to appear, there is evidence of craftsmen making hybrid pendants, hammer and cross together, hedging the spiritual bets of a society in transition. Loki is perhaps the most modern of the Norse gods, a shapeshifter, a trickster, neither entirely good nor entirely evil, causing problems and solving them with equal energy. Always interesting, never entirely safe. In one story, he turns himself into a mare, is impregnated by a stallion, and later gives birth to Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse. This is not a myth that has a simple moral. It is a myth that is simply strange and vivid and alive. And then there is Ragnarok, the end of the world. The Norse vision of the apocalypse is unique in mythology because the gods know it is coming. They know they will lose. The great wolf Fenrir will break free and swallow the sun. The world serpent Jormungandr will rise from the ocean. Odin will die. Thor will die. The world will burn and then sink into the sea. The Norse response to this knowledge is not despair. It is the decision to fight anyway, to meet the end fully, on your feet, doing what is right. The idea that the battle matters even when it cannot be won is perhaps the single most Viking idea of all. Around the year 1000 CE, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who had founded the first European settlement in Greenland, sailed west from Greenland with a crew of 35 men and found a coast that no European had ever seen. He called it Vinland, for the wild grapes or berries his crew found growing there. He spent a winter on this new coast and returned to Greenland with timber being extraordinarily scarce in Greenland, and a report that would send others westward in his wake. For centuries this was considered legend. The sagas described Vinland, described the indigenous people the Norse called Skrælingjar, described settlements and conflicts and failed attempts at permanent colonization. But there was no physical evidence. Columbus discovered America, the history book said, in 1492. The Norse stories were myth. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad were following the coastline of Newfoundland in Canada, when a local fisherman pointed them towards some odd grassy humps in the ground near a place called Lonso Meadows. They excavated. Beneath the turf were the unmistakable foundations of Norse longhouses, iron boat rivets, a bronze cloak pin of a type used in Scandinavia around 1000 CE, a spindle whirl for spinning thread, confirming that women had been there. It was real. The settlement at Lonso Meadows is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It predates Columbus by nearly 500 years. The Norse, sailing in wooden ships with no compass, navigating by stars and birds and the colour of the water, had found North America and built houses there before the year 1000. Why didn't they stay? The sagas give one answer. Conflict with the indigenous population made permanent settlement impossible. The Norse were far from home, with no possibility of reinforcement, and the people who already lived there were not the defenceless monks of Lindisfarne. They were skilled fighters on their own ground. The Norse, practical above all things, decided the timber was not worth the war. They packed their ships and sailed home. North America would wait another 5 centuries for its European disaster. There is a trading town in Sweden called Birka. It sits on a small island in Lake Mälaren west of Stockholm, and in the 9th century it was one of the most cosmopolitan places in the northern world. Merchants came from the Frankish Empire to the west, from Byzantium and the Islamic world to the east, from Britain and Ireland, from the Baltic tribes to the south. Norse traders brought furs, sable, beaver, fox, ermine, which commanded extraordinary prices in the courts of Constantinople and Baghdad. They brought amber from the Baltic shore. They brought walrus ivory from the Arctic, which before elephant ivory became widely available, was one of the most valuable carving materials in the world. They brought, tragically, slaves, and in return they brought back silver. The Islamic world of the 9th and 10th centuries ran on silver dirhams, and Norse traders returned from their eastern journeys with them by the thousands. Hoards of Arabic coins have been found across Scandinavia, buried in fields, hidden under floors, tucked into the foundations of buildings by people who never came back for them. Each hoard is a small tragedy. Each one tells you that someone died unexpectedly, or was taken, or simply never returned from wherever they had gone. The eastern route was called the Varangian route, and it ran from the Baltic down through the river systems of Russia, a word that may itself derive from the Norse term rus, meaning the men who row, through a series of portages where ships were dragged overland, down the Dnieper to the Black Sea and across to Constantinople. Norse warriors served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, the Varangian Guard, a fact recorded in Byzantine chronicles with a mixture of admiration and nervous awe. They were described as enormous, ferocious, and absolutely loyal to whoever was paying them, which was simultaneously their greatest virtue and their greatest limitation. One of the Varangians who served in Constantinople left a record of his visit in the most Viking way possible. In the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, a building of staggering beauty and sacred importance, he carved his name into the marble of the upper gallery railing. The runic inscription reads, partially, Halfdan carved these runes. It has survived for 1,000 years. Halfdan was here. Halfdan wanted you to know. The Viking Age is usually said to end in 1066, the year of the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada was defeated and killed by the English king Harold Godwinson, just days before Harold himself was defeated by the Normans at Hastings. The Normans, incidentally, were themselves descendants of Vikings, Northmen who had settled in northern France 2 generations earlier. So in a strange sense, the Viking Age ended with one Viking, descended force defeating the last Viking invader, and then being immediately overwhelmed by another Viking descended force. History has a dark sense of irony. But the end of the Viking Age as a historical category does not mean the end of the Norse world. The culture, the language, the mythology, the legal traditions, these survived and evolved. Iceland, settled by Norse colonists in the 9th century, developed one of the most extraordinary literary cultures of the medieval world. The sagas, long, complex prose narratives of extraordinary sophistication, were written down in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, preserving stories of the Viking Age with a detail and psychological depth that no other medieval culture matched. The Icelanders were obsessed with memory, with the accurate recording of what had happened, with the importance of knowing who you were and where you came from. They wrote everything down. The Norse left their mark on the English language in ways that most English speakers never notice. The words sky, window, knife, husband, egg, ill, ugly, wrong, anger, flat, odd, loose, and law all come from Old Norse. The days of the week carry Norse gods in them. Tuesday is Tyr's Day, Wednesday is Woden's Day, Thursday is Thor's Day, Friday is Frigg's Day. Every time someone says these words, every mundane Tuesday, every overcast Thursday, they are speaking something 900 years old, a small piece of the North embedded in the everyday. And somewhere in the DNA of millions of people, in Britain, in Ireland, in France, in Russia, in Iceland, in Newfoundland, there are the genes of the Norse. Studies have found that up to 6% of the male population of the British Isles carries Y chromosome markers consistent with Norse ancestry. In parts of northern Scotland and the Scottish Islands, the figure is much higher. In Iceland, the entire population descends from a founding group of Norse settlers and the Irish and Scottish people they brought with them. The Vikings are not gone. They are diffused, spread through the world by the same restlessness that drove their ancestors out onto the open ocean in wooden boats, looking for whatever was over the next horizon. It is winter in Scandinavia. This is not a metaphor. It is specifically, concretely, physically winter, and the darkness has been here for weeks. The sun rose briefly at noon, barely climbed above the horizon, gave an hour of pale grey light, and was gone again. Now it is evening, and the dark is complete, and the cold outside is serious and alive, the kind of cold that has intentions. Inside the longhouse, the fire in the central hearth is the entire world. Its light reaches the carved wooden posts that support the roof, makes them flicker and seem to move. The smoke rises toward the smoke hole in the roof and curls out into the black sky. Around the hearth, a family, a farmer named Gunnar, his wife Sigrid, their 3 children, 2 farmhands, an old man who is Gunnar's uncle and who has not been well this winter. The cattle shift and breathe in the lower end of the hall. A dog is asleep so close to the fire that its fur smells faintly of singing. Sigrid is spinning. Her hands work without requiring attention, the distaff tucked under her arm, the thread growing fine and even beneath her fingers. She's been spinning for so long that the motion is like breathing, automatic, continuous, the body doing what it knows while the mind is somewhere else entirely. The spindle whirl turning slowly, the thread lengthening. Gunnar is telling a story. This is what you do on a winter evening in the Norse world, when the dark has closed in and the work that can be done indoors is done and the night stretches out ahead. You tell stories. The sagas were not written things first. They were spoken things, memorized and recited and shaped over generations until they had the weight and density of something true, even when they were not literally true. The story Gunnar is telling tonight is one his father told him, and his father before him, a story of a man who went looking for something he had lost and found, instead, something he had not known he was missing. The children are listening with the particular quality of attention that children give to stories in the firelight, total, physical, the whole body oriented toward the voice. The youngest has her thumb in her mouth and her eyes are going. The middle child is fighting sleep with the grim determination of a 9-year-old who does not want to miss the end. The oldest, 12, is trying to look like she's too old for this. She's not too old for this. Nobody is too old for this. Outside, the wind has come up. It moves across the turf roof with a low, steady sound, occasionally sharpening into something higher. The timbers of the longhouse settle and creak. The fire shudders once and then steadies. The cattle shift. The dog's legs move in some dream of running. In a few months, the ice will break. The ships will be dragged from their winter shelters onto the water. The oars will find their rhythm. The sail will catch the wind. And these people, or people like them, or the children of people like them, will go out again into the world and find whatever's out there. Coasts they have never seen, rivers they have never followed, cities of extraordinary strangeness and wealth, stars that look different in the south, people with different languages and different gods and different ways of measuring what a life is worth. But that is spring. That is later. Tonight there is only the fire and the story and the sound of the wind that cannot get in, and the weight of the dark that is simply the dark. Not threatening, not sinister, just the long Norse winter doing what it has always done, pressing close, and the warmth inside pressing back. The Vikings crossed oceans without compasses. They buried their dead in ships because they believed the journey continues. They wrote their names in the marble of the greatest church in the world just to say, "I was here." They built legal systems, told stories of gods who knew they would lose and fought anyway, raised children in longhouses while the Arctic wind pressed against the walls, and dreamed of green coasts over the western horizon that turned out to be real. They were not the monsters of legend. They were not the noble savages of modern romanticization either. They were human beings, complicated, contradictory, occasionally violent, frequently practical, sometimes breathtakingly brave, always restless. They were people who looked at the edge of the known world and thought, let us see what is past it. That quality, the refusal to accept the horizon as a limit, is their real legacy. Not the raids, not the longships, not the horned helmets that they never actually wore. The idea that what lies beyond the edge of what you know is worth finding. That the ocean, however dark and cold, is crossable. That somewhere out there is a shore you have not stood on yet. Let the north carry you now. Let the fire burn low. Let the story end the way stories end in longhouses on winter nights, not with a conclusion, but with a silence that holds everything in it, warm and dark and full. This has been Midnight Chronicle. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are.